The night sky erupted with blinding flashes as American gunners unleashed a barrage of artillery shells toward unseen targets. German tank commanders, confident in the cover of darkness, never expected the precision bombardment that decimated their Panzer divisions before the first light of dawn. This remarkable tactic changed the course of many battles on the Western Front and struck fear into the hearts of the Wehrmacht's most experienced tank commanders. It was the winter of 1944. The Allied forces were pushing toward Germany's western border, but progress had slowed as Nazi tank divisions launched devastating nighttime counterattacks. American infantry divisions were suffering heavy casualties, as Panzers would emerge from the darkness, wreak havoc, and disappear before effective resistance could be mounted. Sergeant James Miller, a forward artillery observer with the 14th Field Artillery Battalion, watched helplessly one night as a company of Sherman tanks was ambushed and destroyed by Panzer IVs that seemed to materialize from nowhere. "We couldn't see them coming," he later wrote in his journal. "They'd wait until the darkest hours, roll in with engines muffled, hit us hard, and then vanish. We were fighting ghosts." The situation was becoming desperate. Allied command feared these nighttime raids would significantly delay the advance into Germany. Something had to change, and fast. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Thompson, an artillery officer who had been a sound engineer in civilian life, had been experimenting with acoustic targeting systems. "Sound travels at a consistent speed," Thompson explained to skeptical superiors. "If we can detect the unique acoustic signature of a Panzer engine from multiple listening posts, we can triangulate their position even in total darkness." The concept wasn't entirely new. Sound ranging had been used since World War I, but Thompson's innovation was in the detection equipment and rapid calculation methods that allowed for nearly real-time targeting. His system used specialized microphones placed in a wide arc that could pick up the distinctive rumble of German tanks from miles away. Colonel William Hawkins, commander of the 4th Armored Division's Artillery Regiment, was initially dismissive. "You want my men to fire at noises in the dark? That's not artillery, that's a waste of ammunition," he reportedly told Thompson during their first meeting. But with mounting casualties and the tactical advantage clearly in the Germans' favor after sundown, Hawkins reluctantly agreed to a trial. The first test came on a moonless night near the Hürtgen forest. Intelligence had reported that elements of the 2nd Panzer Division were preparing for a midnight assault on American positions. Thompson's team set up their sound detection equipment along a 5-mile front. Private First Class Richard Donovan was one of the soldiers manning the listening posts that night. "It was eerie," he recalled years later. "We sat in absolute silence. These weird microphones pointed toward enemy lines, headphones on, waiting. Around 11:30, I heard it, the unmistakable low growl of Panzer engines starting up, miles away. The data from multiple listening posts was quickly relayed to a central calculation station where Lieutenant Sarah Andrews, a mathematics prodigy recruited from Vassar College, and performed rapid triangulation calculations. We had 3 minutes, maximum, from detection to firing solution," Andrews later explained. The Germans were smart. They'd move in zigzag patterns to confuse conventional observers. But sound doesn't lie. At precisely 11:42 p.m., without visual confirmation of any targets, Colonel Hawkins gave the unprecedented order. "Fire mission, grid. Coordinates Echo 59er. Suspected Panzer concentration. Fire for effect." Dozens of 105mm howitzers roared to life, sending shells arcing through the black sky toward an enemy they couldn't see. The results exceeded all expectations. When dawn broke, reconnaissance aircraft reported at least 17 destroyed Panzer IVs, and Tigers scattered across the target area. Intercepted radio communications revealed the Germans were in disarray, completely bewildered by artillery strikes that had found them with uncanny accuracy in total darkness. "How did they know we were there?" Captured Oberleutnant Franz Weber later asked his American interrogators. "It was like they could see through the night itself." My men thought it was some kind of American witchcraft. It wasn't witchcraft, it was American ingenuity. Thompson's system, soon nicknamed Phantom Fire, was quickly expanded along the entire Western Front. Special sound-ranging units were formed, and crews trained in the delicate art of listening for the enemy. The psychological impact was perhaps even more valuable than the tactical advantage. German tank commanders, once confident in the protection darkness provided, now felt vulnerable at all times. Tank movement at night decreased dramatically, giving Allied forces precious hours to regroup and strengthen positions. Major General George Patton, upon hearing of the system's success, personally visited Thompson's unit. "This," he proclaimed while slapping Thompson on the back, "is exactly the kind of thinking that wins wars. Not just muscle and metal, but minds and innovation." The technology wasn't perfect. Rain, strong winds, and battlefield noise could interfere with the sensitive microphones. The Germans, once they realized what was happening, attempted countermeasures, running tanks at irregular intervals, using decoy engine sounds, and trying to avoid predictable gathering points. Sergeant Eric Peterson, who commanded one of the forward listening posts, recalled a particularly tense night near Aachen. "We picked up tank engines, but something seemed off. The pattern was too regular, too predictable. I reported it as a probable decoy. His instinct proved correct. The real attack came from a different direction, but because other listening posts had detected those movements too, the artillery was ready." What made the system truly effective was the human element, the trained ears that could distinguish between different engine types, recognize decoys, and sense when something wasn't right. Technical Sergeant Maria Vasquez, one of the few women who served in the forward areas with the sound-ranging units, was renowned for her ability to identify not just that a tank was moving, but what type it was. "A Tiger has a deeper growl than a Panzer IV," she explained in training sessions. "And the Panzer IVs with the upgraded engines have a distinctive whine that the older models lack. Listen for the patterns, not just the presence." By January 1945, the Germans had lost the night. Their once effective tactic of darkness raids had been neutralized, forcing them to commit resources during daylight hours when Allied air superiority made movement extremely hazardous. It was a tactical vice that squeezed tighter with each passing day. The story of the sound-ranging artillery units nearly faded into obscurity after the war. The technology was classified, and many of the men and women who made it work returned to civilian life without fanfare. It wasn't until decades later, when military historians began interviewing veterans and reviewing declassified documents, that the full impact of what they'd accomplished became clear. Dr. Jonathan Hayes, military historian at Princeton University, described it as a perfect example of asymmetric advantage, using science and creativity to neutralize an enemy's tactical superiority without requiring massive resources or technological breakthroughs. For the men on the ground, it was more personal. Infantry Lieutenant David Schwartz wrote in his memoirs, "Before the sound-ranging artillery, we dreaded sundown. Every rustle in the dark could be death approaching. After they started picking off those Panzers in the dark, we actually slept at night." You can't put a price on that kind of relief. The German response to these mysterious nighttime bombardments reveals how effective they were. Field Marshal Walter Model issued specific orders prohibiting large concentrations of armor after dark and mandated wider dispersal of tank units. "We must assume the Americans can see us at all times," he wrote in a directive to his tank commanders. "Act accordingly." This dispersal of forces further reduced the effectiveness of German armored counterattacks, which relied on concentrated firepower and shock value. By forcing the Panzers to spread out, the sound-ranging units indirectly weakened the punch of each assault, even when tanks weren't destroyed outright. Private James O'Neill, an artillery loader with the 177th Field Artillery Battalion, remembered the night they received their first sound-ranging fire mission. The lieutenant comes running in with these strange coordinates, saying we need to hit this empty patch of forest, right now, full battery fire. We thought he'd lost his mind, but we did it, and the next morning patrol found 3 Tigers and a half-dozen supply trucks blown to hell. After that, we never questioned those weird midnight fire orders again. What began as an experimental system with one artillery battalion soon expanded to a network covering the entire front. By March 1945, over 30 specialized sound-ranging units were operating alongside conventional artillery battalions. The system became so refined that operators could often tell whether tanks were in combat formation or merely repositioning, allowing commanders to prioritize the most threatening concentrations. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. One of the most dramatic successes came during the Battle of the Bulge, when sound-ranging units detected a massive concentration of German armor gathering for what would become Hitler's last major offensive in the West. Unfortunately, heavy snowfall and extreme cold had degraded many of the listening systems, and the full extent of the build-up wasn't appreciated until the attack was underway. Even so, those units that remained operational helped direct artillery fire that blunted several key thrusts during the battle. Lieutenant Thompson's innovation didn't just save American lives, it changed how artillery would be used in future conflicts. The concept of firing blind with confidence, relying on sensors rather than direct observation, became a cornerstone of modern artillery doctrine. Today's sophisticated radar and drone systems trace their conceptual lineage back to those crude microphones in the forests of Western Europe. For the German tank crews, the psychological impact can't be overstated. Hauptmann Klaus Weder, who commanded a company of Panzer IVs, described the effect in his post-war memoir. "We had owned the night. It was our time, our advantage. Then suddenly, without warning, death rained from above with impossible accuracy. Men became superstitious, reluctant to move after dark. Some believed the Americans had developed a way to see through night itself. The truth that they could hear us was perhaps more terrifying. The sound-ranging system wasn't the only innovation that helped turn the tide against German armor. Improved air support, better anti-tank weapons, and the increasing numerical superiority of Allied forces all played crucial roles. But the ability to strike effectively at night, to deny the enemy the protection of darkness, was a unique advantage that accelerated the collapse of German resistance in the war's final months. Captain Thomas Miller, an artillery officer who worked closely with one of the sound-ranging units, perhaps summed it up best. "War is about advantages, finding them, exploiting them, and denying them to your enemy." The Germans thought darkness was their advantage, something we couldn't overcome. Proving them wrong didn't just destroy tanks, it destroyed their confidence. As the Allies pushed deeper into Germany in the spring of 1945, the need for the sound-ranging units diminished. German armoured forces were depleted, fuel was scarce, and the Luftwaffe had been all but eliminated. The advantage of nighttime movement no longer outweighed the risks. Many of the specialized sound operators were reassigned to conventional artillery units for the final push to Berlin. After the war, Lieutenant Colonel Thompson, whose innovation had saved countless Allied lives, received little public recognition. The system remained classified for years, and Thompson himself returned to civilian life as a sound engineer for a radio network. It wasn't until 1967 that he received the Distinguished Service Cross for his contribution to the war effort, in a small ceremony attended mainly by former members of his sound-ranging units. The true legacy of Thompson's innovation isn't measured in medals or public acclaim, but in the lives saved and the tactics it inspired. Major General James Bradford, who commanded an infantry division that benefited from the system, later wrote, "Thompson's sound-ranging artillery gave my men something invaluable, the knowledge that they wouldn't be surprised in the dark, that our big guns could reach out and touch the enemy even when we couldn't see them. That kind of confidence changes how men fight, how they hold ground, how they push forward. For the gunners themselves, firing at unseen targets based solely on sound data required a leap of faith. Artillery had traditionally been a visual business. Observers would spot targets and call in corrections until shells found their mark. Firing blind at coordinates derived from sound readings seemed counterintuitive, even wasteful, to many experienced artillerymen. Staff Sergeant William Cooper, a gun commander with the 4th Armoured Division's artillery, admitted his skepticism. First time they gave us one of those sound-ranging fire missions, I thought we were just throwing shells into empty forest. But the battalion commander was insistent fire, exactly as directed, no questions. When we saw the results the next morning, every gunner in the battery became a believer. The sound-ranging system revealed something profound about warfare itself, that advantages often come not from overwhelming force or technological superiority, but from creative applications of existing tools and knowledge. The microphones weren't particularly advanced. The mathematical principles of triangulation had been understood for centuries. What made the difference was putting these elements together in a new way to solve a specific tactical problem. As winter gave way to spring in 1945, and Allied forces pressed deeper into Germany, the nature of the fighting changed. Urban combat became more common, making the sound-ranging system less effective amid the echo chambers of destroyed cities. But by then, its job was largely done. The German capacity for coordinated armoured counterattacks had been broken, in no small part because they could no longer rely on darkness for protection. The lessons learned from the sound-ranging artillery units weren't forgotten after World War II. During the Korean War, improved versions of the system helped United Nations forces detect and disrupt North Korean and Chinese troop movements at night. In Vietnam, more sophisticated acoustic sensors were deployed along the Ho Chi Minh Trail to monitor enemy supply movements. Today's battlefield sensing systems, from ground-penetrating radar to thermal imaging and acoustic detection arrays, owe a conceptual debt to those first crude microphones in the European forests. The fundamental insight remains the same. Find ways to detect what cannot be seen, and deny the enemy any safe haven, any time of day. For the men and women who operated those first sound-ranging systems in the winter of 1944–45, their contribution was simple but profound. They turned night historically the ally of those seeking to move undetected into just another time when American artillery could find and destroy its targets. When German tank commanders realized they had lost the protection of darkness, when they understood that their engines could betray them from miles away, the psychological impact was devastating. As one captured German officer put it, Americans were supposed to be technologically advanced but tactically naive. The sound-ranging artillery proved that assumption dangerously wrong. The story of how American gunners fired blind at night and obliterated Panzers before dawn isn't just about technology or tactics. It's about the human capacity for adaptation and innovation under pressure. It's about finding light in darkness, quite literally, and turning a disadvantage into an advantage through creativity and determination. As the war in Europe drew to its inevitable close in the spring of 1945, the sound-ranging units that had contributed so significantly to Allied success were quietly disbanded. Many of the specialists returned to civilian life, taking their unique skills back to universities, research laboratories, and engineering firms. Their wartime experience with acoustics and signal processing contributed to post-war advances in sound recording, telecommunications, and eventually computer science. Lieutenant Sarah Andrews, the mathematics prodigy who had performed those crucial triangulation calculations, went on to a distinguished career in physics, eventually working on early warning radar systems during the Cold War. "What we did with sound in 1944, she noted in a 1975 interview, laid the groundwork for much of what followed in remote sensing and detection technology. We proved you could locate and target what you couldn't see if you understood the physics well enough." For the German Panzer forces, the American ability to target them in darkness remained something of a mystery until the war's end. Various theories circulated among tank crews, infrared vision devices, radar-guided shells, even rumors of American bombers dropping special illumination that was visible only to Allied forces. The truth that it was their own engines betraying them was both simpler and more elegant than the elaborate technologies they imagined. As Allied forces advanced through the German heartland in the final months of the war, the sound-ranging artillery units faced new challenges. Dense urban environments created complex acoustic landscapes where engine sounds echoed off bombed-out buildings and reverberated through narrow streets. What had worked brilliantly in forests and open countryside required adaptation for city fighting. Captain Michael Donovan, who had helped refine the system after its initial success, led efforts to modify the equipment for urban combat. We needed more microphones at closer intervals, and we had to develop new calculation models that accounted for echo effects, he explained in a technical report filed just before the German surrender. But the principles remained sound. If it makes noise, we can find it. In the bombed-out ruins of Cologne, a specialized sound-ranging team demonstrated this urban adaptation with devastating effectiveness. Elements of the 9th Panzer Division had been using the city's underground garage networks to hide tanks during daylight hours, emerging only for night operations. Traditional reconnaissance couldn't locate these hidden staging areas. Sergeant Elena Rodriguez, a sound technician with specialized training in architectural acoustics, proposed a solution. Tank engines have distinctive startup sequences, she noted in her field report. If we can capture those sounds and analyze their distortion patterns as they travel through the urban landscape, we can backtrack to their origin points, even when they're underground. Over 3 consecutive nights, Rodriguez's team recorded the sounds of German tanks emerging from hidden locations. By the 4th night, they had mapped 7 concealed tank shelters. A massive coordinated artillery barrage collapsed the underground structures while the tanks were still inside them, neutralizing an entire battalion without a single American casualty. Word of this success spread quickly through German ranks. A radio intercept captured a German officer warning his colleagues, "The Americans have ears everywhere. If your tank makes a sound, consider yourself already targeted." The psychological warfare potential was immediately recognized by Allied commanders. Artillery units would sometimes fire seemingly random barrages into areas where no enemy activity had been reported, just to reinforce the impression that American guns could find targets anywhere, anytime. Propaganda leaflets dropped behind German lines featured images of artillery shells raining down on tanks in the dark, with captions like, "We hear you coming. We fire before you arrive." Lieutenant Colonel Thompson, visiting a forward command post near Frankfurt, witnessed the psychological impact firsthand when interviewing a captured Panzer commander. The young officer kept looking nervously at the ceiling whenever a vehicle passed nearby, Thompson recalled. When I asked why, he explained they had been conditioned to associate engine noise with imminent artillery fire. Even in captivity, the sound of motors made him flinch. This psychological edge proved as valuable as the tactical advantage. German tank units, already suffering from fuel shortages and mechanical failures, became increasingly hesitant to maneuver at night. Maintenance operations, which often required running engines for testing, were postponed or conducted in daylight when Allied air superiority made them vulnerable to attack from above. By April 1945, with American forces pushing toward Berlin from the west and Soviet armies advancing from the east, what remained of Germany's once formidable Panzer divisions was in disarray. Fuel was critically scarce, experienced crews had been decimated, and the psychological toll of fighting an enemy that could strike accurately in darkness had eroded morale to breaking point. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding German forces in the west during these final months, later acknowledged the impact of the American night artillery in his memoirs. It was not simply the physical destruction of our tanks, though that was significant. It was the complete loss of night as a safe time for movement and repositioning. When you cannot move freely in darkness, when even the sound of your engines draws fire, your tactical options become severely limited. For the American artillery crews who had initially doubted the concept of firing blind, the vindication was both professional and personal. Staff Sergeant James Wilson, a howitzer section chief, described the transformation. "At first, we were shooting at map coordinates that seemed random to us. We'd fire into the night and wonder if we were hitting anything. Then we started getting reconnaissance photos the next morning showing destroyed enemy tanks exactly where we'd fired. That changes how you feel about your work." The sound-ranging system reached its technical peak just as the war in Europe was ending. By May 1945, the newest versions incorporated automated calculation tables that reduced the time from sound detection to firing solution to less than 60 seconds. Some units were experimenting with recording equipment that could identify individual tanks by their unique acoustic signatures, a primitive form of what would later be called acoustic, fingerprinting. Lieutenant Sarah Andrews, reflecting on this rapid evolution, noted, "What began as a stopgap measure became an entire field of military science in less than a year. We were developing capabilities in weeks that would normally have taken years of research and testing." War accelerates innovation like nothing else. As Nazi Germany collapsed and the war in Europe ended, many of the sound-ranging specialists found their skills suddenly less critical. Some were reassigned to the Pacific Theatre, where different terrain and tactics required new approaches. Others were discharged and returned to civilian life, carrying their specialized knowledge with them. The impact of their innovation extended far beyond World War II. Korean War artillery units employed refined versions of the system to detect communist forces moving under cover of darkness. In Vietnam, acoustic sensors dropped along infiltration routes could detect truck convoys moving down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, triggering airstrikes with minimal delay. Today's modern battlefield sensors, from ground surveillance radar to distributed acoustic sensing networks, share conceptual DNA with those first crude microphones in the European forests. The fundamental insight that technology can extend human perception beyond natural limits remains at the core of military innovation. For the men who operated the original sound-ranging systems, their contribution represented something profound about American character. Sergeant William Parker, who served with one of the first units, put it this way in a 1975 reunion speech: "We weren't the biggest army at first, or the best equipped, but we could think on our feet. We could solve problems with what we had. That's what made us different." The German perspective on the sound-ranging artillery evolved over time. Initially dismissed as lucky guesswork or the result of spies reporting tank positions, the true nature of the system gradually became understood. By war's end, German technical intelligence had pieced together a reasonably accurate picture of how it worked, but too late to develop effective countermeasures. Kurt Meyer, a Tiger tank commander captured in March 1945, described the psychological impact in his debriefing. "We began to feel hunted at all times. Every engine start might bring death from above. Some crews took to manually pushing their tanks short distances rather than risk starting engines when artillery might be listening. Can you imagine men pushing 60-ton Tigers in the mud to avoid detection? That shows the level of fear these invisible guns created." The sound-ranging artillery success illustrates a broader truth about warfare that advantages often come not from superior firepower or numbers, but from asymmetric capabilities that the enemy cannot easily counter. The Germans had no effective way to silence their tank engines or mask their acoustic signatures. Once the Americans discovered how to exploit this vulnerability, an entire dimension of tactical advantage shifted dramatically. Major General Bradley, commenting on the system in a post-war analysis, observed, "The beauty of it was its simplicity. We didn't need to see the enemy to destroy him. We just needed to listen carefully and respond quickly." Sometimes the most effective innovations are not about new weapons, but new ways of using the weapons you already have. The human stories behind the technology reveal how individual initiative can change the course of battles and, ultimately, wars. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson, whose background in sound engineering sparked the original concept, never sought recognition for his innovation. When asked about his contribution years later, he reportedly shrugged and said, "It seemed obvious to me. Sound travels, calculations work. The real credit goes to the men and women who turned a concept into a working system under combat conditions." Those men and women came from diverse backgrounds, and that reflected America itself. The sound detection teams included former music teachers who could distinguish subtle tonal differences in engine sounds, physics students who understood acoustic propagation, and mathematicians who could perform complex triangulation calculations under pressure. Their collective expertise created a capability greater than any individual contribution. Corporal Maria Vasquez, one of the few women who served with the forward sound-ranging teams, brought her experience as a piano tuner to the battlefield. "Different engines have different harmonics, just like piano strings," she explained to new recruits. "Once you train your ear to hear those differences, you can tell a Panzer IV from a Tiger from a Stug, even when they're miles away." This integration of civilian expertise into military application represented a distinctly American approach to problem solving. While German engineering relied heavily on specially trained technical experts working within rigid hierarchies, the American sound-ranging teams drew on diverse skills and encouraged innovation at all levels. Private First Class James O'Connor, who had been a radio repair technician before the war, recalled modifying the standard microphones to filter out wind noise, a simple change that dramatically improved detection range during stormy weather. "I just did what made sense," he said later. "Nobody told me I couldn't try to make things work better." By the final months of the war, German tank crews had developed a healthy respect and fear for American artillery. Intercepted communications revealed that they called the incoming shells ghost rounds because they seemed to appear without warning, as if guided by supernatural forces. Some tank commanders reportedly carried good luck charms they believed would protect them from the unseen American guns. The sound-ranging system's legacy extended into civilian technology after the war. The same principles of acoustic, detection, and triangulation later informed seismology, underwater sensing systems, and even medical diagnostic tools. Veterans who had worked with the system went on to careers in acoustics, telecommunications, and early computing, bringing their wartime experience to bear on peacetime challenges. Dr. Robert Thompson, who had conceived the original system, later helped develop sonar improvements that revolutionized underwater detection capabilities. "The principles are the same," he explained in a 1962 technical paper. "Whether you're tracking a submarine under the ocean or a tank in a forest, you're listening for distinctive sounds and calculating their point of origin." For the artillery crews who actually fired the guns, the sound-ranging system changed their fundamental relationship with their weapons. Traditionally, artillery had been a somewhat distant form of combat. Gunners rarely saw the effects of their shells directly. But the knowledge that their fire was precisely targeting enemy tanks, even in darkness, created a more immediate connection to the battlefield. Sergeant Thomas Miller, a gun commander with the 4th Armored Division's Artillery Battalion, expressed this changed perspective. "Before, we were just putting shells on coordinates. After we started working with the sound-ranging teams, we felt like we were actively hunting. There's a difference between firing at a grid square and firing at tanks, are there, even if you can't see them." As the war drew to a close, the sound-ranging units faced a final challenge that tested the limits of their system. In a desperate bid to slow the Allied advance, German forces had begun using small groups of tanks operating independently rather than in conventional formations. These isolated vehicles were harder to detect acoustically and required more precise calculations to target effectively. Captain David Roberts, commanding one of the most experienced sound-ranging teams, responded by developing what he called predictive acoustic patterns. By studying maps and terrain features, his team identified likely approach routes and concentrated their microphones accordingly. "Tanks follow paths of least resistance," he explained in his field manual. "Predict where they'll go, listen carefully, and you'll find them." This adaptation proved remarkably effective during the Battle of Remagen in March 1945, when German armor attempted to dislodge American forces that had captured the Ludendorff Bridge. Sound-ranging units detected and directed artillery fire against tank units approaching through supposedly concealed ravines and forest roads, preventing them from reaching effective firing positions. The bridge at Remagen represented the first crossing of the Rhine by Allied forces, a crucial strategic breakthrough into Germany's industrial heartland. Its successful defense against armored counterattacks, facilitated in large part by the sound-ranging artillery, accelerated the collapse of German resistance in the West. For the German High Command, the American ability to target tanks in darkness remained something of a mystery until the war's end. Various theories circulated among German intelligence officers, from infrared vision devices to networks of spies reporting tank movements. The truth that it was the sound of their own engines betraying them was both simpler and more elegant than the elaborate technologies they imagined. Hauptmann Karl Weber, a German artillery officer captured in April 1945, expressed grudging admiration during his interrogation. "It was the perfect countermeasure to our night tactics. We thought darkness was our ally, but you Americans turned our own engines against us. It was brilliant and infuriating in equal measure. The sound-ranging system represented a perfect example of asymmetric advantage, using relatively simple technology to neutralize an enemy's tactical superiority without requiring massive resources. While Germany struggled with fuel shortages and production disruptions from bombing campaigns, America's innovation required only microphones, calculation tables, and trained listeners' resources that were readily available and easily replaced. For the men on the ground, the system's effectiveness was measured in very personal terms. Private James Wilson, an infantryman with the 1st Infantry Division, expressed it simply: "Before those sound-ranging artillery units started knocking out Panzers at night, every sunset felt like a death sentence. We'd dig in and pray we wouldn't get overrun before morning. After they started picking off German tanks in the dark, we actually slept at night. You can't put a price on that kind of relief." As Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany in the spring of 1945, the need for the specialized sound-ranging units gradually diminished. German armored forces were depleted, fuel was scarce, and the Luftwaffe had been all but eliminated from the skies. The advantage of nighttime movement no longer outweighed the risks for the few remaining Panzer units. Many of the sound-ranging specialists were reassigned to conventional artillery units for the final push to Berlin. Others were sent to the Pacific Theater, where different terrain and tactical conditions required new approaches. Some began training for the anticipated invasion of Japan, developing modified systems suited to the dense jungle environments they expected to encounter. The unconditional surrender of Germany in May 1945 marked the end of the European conflict, but the innovations that had helped secure victory lived on. Technical manuals documenting the sound-ranging system were compiled and classified, preserving the knowledge for future conflicts. Veterans who had operated the system carried their expertise into civilian life, where many applied similar principles to peacetime problems in fields ranging from oceanography to urban planning. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson, whose initial concept had saved countless Allied lives, received little public recognition in the immediate aftermath of the war. The system remained classified for years, and Thompson himself returned to civilian life as a research scientist. It wasn't until 1967 that he received the Distinguished Service Cross for his contribution to the war effort, in a small ceremony attended mainly by former members of his sound-ranging units. The true measure of Thompson's innovation isn't found in medals or public acclaim, but in the lives saved and the tactical advantage gained during a critical phase of the war. As General Eisenhower noted in his memoirs, victory in war often hinges not on grand strategy alone, but on specific tactical innovations that solve immediate problems. The ability to effectively target enemy armor at night removed a significant advantage the Germans had exploited skillfully, and helped accelerate the collapse of their resistance in the West. For the artillery crews who had initially doubted the concept of firing at unseen targets based solely on sound data, the success of the system changed their understanding of their role on the battlefield. No longer limited to supporting daylight operations or responding to visual spotting, artillery had become a 24-hour threat that denied the enemy any safe period for movement or resupply. This expanded capability fundamentally altered the dynamics of combat operations in ways that extended far beyond World War II. In Korea, Vietnam, and later conflicts, the principle that artillery could effectively engage targets without direct visual confirmation became a cornerstone of modern fire support doctrine. The legacy of those first sound-ranging units lives on in today's battlefield, sensing systems from ground-penetrating radar to thermal imaging and acoustic detection arrays. The fundamental insight remains the same: find ways to detect what cannot be seen and deny the enemy any safe haven, any time of day or night. For the men and women who operated those first sound-ranging systems in the winter of 1944–45, their contribution was simple but profound. They turned night historically, the ally of those seeking to move undetected, into just another time when American artillery could find and destroy its targets with terrifying accuracy. When German tank commanders realized they had lost the protection of darkness, when they understood that their engines could betray them from miles away, the psychological impact was devastating. As one captured German officer put it, Americans were supposed to be technologically advanced but tactically naive. The sound-ranging artillery proved that assumption dangerously wrong. The story of how American gunners fired blind at night and obliterated Panzers before dawn isn't just about technology or tactics. It's about the human capacity for adaptation and innovation under pressure. It's about finding light in darkness, quite literally, and turning a disadvantage into an advantage through creativity, determination, and the willingness to try new approaches when conventional methods fall short. In that sense, the sound-ranging artillery stands as a symbol of the broader American contribution to Allied victory, a combination of industrial might, tactical flexibility, and innovative problem-solving that ultimately overwhelmed a formidable enemy. The system wasn't the most complex technology developed during the war, nor the most expensive, but its impact on the battlefield was profound and immediate. As we look back across the decades that separate us from those dark nights in the European forests, we can appreciate not just the technical achievement, but the human story behind it, the sound engineers and mathematicians, the artillery officers willing to try unproven methods, and the gunners who fired with confidence at targets they couldn't see but knew were there. Their legacy lives on not just in military technology, but in the broader principle they embodied, that seemingly insurmountable problems often yield to creative solutions when minds are free to innovate, and leadership is willing to embrace new ideas, even in the most dire circumstances. The night no longer belonged to the enemy. With American ingenuity and determination, darkness itself had been conquered, and with it, a crucial advantage that helped hasten the end of history's most destructive conflict and bring peace to a war-torn world. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.